How do you go from prisoner to public defender to acclaimed poet? Reginald Dwayne Betts will join us to talk about his new collection, Felon. Who are the Song Sisters of China, and how did their very different lives reflect that country's 20th century history? Jung Chang will tell us about her latest book, Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister. Plus, our critics will talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Reginald Dwayne Betts joins us from New Haven. He is a poet, an essayist, national spokesperson for the Campaign for Youth Justice. His new book is called Felon. Dwayne, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I would love for you to start with a poem from this new collection, Felon. Tell us a little bit about it and then read.
It's called Essay on Reentry, and it's one of those poems that is personal and had me thinking about the fact that, you do time in prison and you think you could just move on with your life. And even if society lets you, which it typically doesn't, you still have to talk about your history with people you love. And in this case, I'm kind of trying to tell my son. And it's about me thinking about that in the context of, my kid being 5 years old and having to learn this thing that I'd rather him not have to know it all. Essay on Reentry. At 2 a.m., without enough spirit
spilling into my liver to know to keep my mouth shut, my youngest learned of years I spent inside a box. A spell, a kind of incantation I was under. Not whiskey, but history. I robbed a man. This, months before he would drop bucket after bucket on opposing players. The entire bedraggled bunch 5 and 6 and Heath leaping as if every layup erases something. That's how I saw it. My screaming, coaching, sweating presence recompense for the pen. My father has never seen me play ball as part of this. My oldest knew, told of my crimes by a stranger. Tell me we aren't running towards failure is what I want to ask my sons. But it is 2 a.m. The oldest has gone off to dream in the comfort of his room. The youngest, despite him seeming more lucid than me, just reflects cartoons back from his eyes. So when he tells me, "Daddy, it's okay," I know what's happening is some scraggling angel, lost from his pack, finding a way to fulfill his duty, lending words to this kid who crawls into my arms, wanting more than stories of my prison.
The sleep that he fought while I held court at a bar with men who knew that when the drinking was done, the drinking wouldn't make the stories we brought home any easier to tell.
Thank you. This is your third collection of poetry, and yet I'm assuming this is the collection that really addresses that period in your life the most head-on. Talk about why this collection and what you were trying to do with it and why you went back.
I'm 39 now, and, the collections, they all sort of circle this wagon, but the wagon is really complicated. And I might argue that the first, Shaheed reads his own poem, is really like me thinking about the time that I spent in prison and me thinking about these stories that I encountered, friends that I knew, and also, using my imagination to sort of explore that space. Ambassadors of the Reagan era was different. It was a thing that was kind of me thinking about the war on drugs, but me thinking about the ramification of that years out. I was teaching in D.C. at the time, and I was thinking about the thing is like we, like me and then my children, but really me and like these kids that I was teaching, we were like the sort of children of the war on drugs, right? And so I was writing through that and thinking about that and trying to think about the ways in which people in the community were sort of complicit in the kind of destruction as well as the system. But Felon is a different book in the sense that I'm older now, and it's me really thinking about the post-incarceration experience. It's me writing through the lens of somebody that's a dad, but it's also me trying to grapple with a range of things that people, myself included, but sometimes things that I haven't dealt with. I'm trying to write through those things because at the end of the day, we forget that you come out into the world and you come out into the entire world. And so you struggle a lot of ways.
What are some of those issues that you wanted to grapple with in these poems?
Some of them are the sort of more obvious ones. So you got challenges finding employment, stigma, But there's other ones that I think suggest a different level of vulnerability. So you got, alcoholism, you got mental health issues, you got domestic violence, you got sexual assault. I wanted to think about the ways in which it's just this whole landscape of harm that exists that we don't address. And I wanted to find ways to write about all of it. And then you got some love poems too. You got some poems about the ways in which love doesn't work. You got some poems about the ways in which men let people that they love down. And it's me trying to explore the complicated ways in which we figure out how to be human once we come home.
You wrote about your path from prison to public defender to poet in a piece that you wrote for the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago that I won the National Magazine Award. For those who haven't read it, and I hope people will go and look it up after listening to this podcast, tell us a little bit about that story and how you ended up in prison to begin with.
The first part is pretty easy, I guess, because it was right around this time in December 1996. I carjacked a man. December 7th, actually. And I got arrested on December 8th and wouldn't get out of the penitentiary until March 4th, 2005. And I pled guilty, and I was sentenced to 9 years, and I did my time. And with the piece in the New York Times Magazine, what I'm grappling with really is that distance between the day that thing happened and then me ended up working in the public defender's office, representing teenagers, representing people who have committed crimes similar to my own. Actually, I represented one guy who had actually been locked up in Virginia, though we wouldn't have overlapped, but, he had been locked up and he definitely would have overlapped with men that I knew. It's complicated. I try to go through all of the different things that I confronted when I came home and the different things that people confront, whether it's trying to get an apartment, whether it's trying to get enrolled in a college, whether it's trying to figure out how to fall in love, and then doing all of those things while knowing that the crime you committed was serious and warrants some kind of reckoning, but maybe not the kind of reckoning that you get from the world. And then ultimately, I decided to go to law school, and the piece is, why would I make this seemingly absurd decision? When you get sworn in and become a member of the bar, you're officer of the court. And it was a complete 180 from who I had been when I was 16 and carjacking a person to, wanting to be an officer of the court. And what did it mean to make all of these decisions and sort of do all of these things that I imagined was me showing the world that I changed my life and showing myself and showing my family, but still be confronted with the fact that this thing that I did at 16 might prevent me from being an attorney.
I want to approach that path through the lens of your reading and your writing. And I'll leave the story, the larger story, hopefully, again, for people to go and look at that piece and to read the poems in your three collections. But let's start with the time when you were in prison. Did you read poetry there, and what did you read?
It's funny. I mean, I didn't expect to be a poet, but it was rare that I was in the hole, and I asked for a book, and somebody slid this book called The Black Poets under my cell door. And the poet, really, two poets that led me to become a poet. First was Etheridge Knight, and the first poem I read by him was this poem called For Freckle-Faced Gerald, and it completely refigured how I thought about myself and the world. But also, he had been locked up for burglary, and he did 6 or 7 years in prison. And so it was in his bio, and I saw that he had did, and I just imagined I could do this. And the second poet was Lucille Clifton, who just really reshaped the way I thought about being a person in the world and really reshaped what I thought about what language could do.
You wrote about that for the Books Desk here at the Times. So tell us a little bit about Clifton and how did reading those poems reshape your conception of yourself?
And one way is that she was writing about things that you could tell people were afraid to sort of dig into what it meant to be them, right? So she would write poems about the regret that she dealt with, not the regret that she dealt with, but the regret that somebody might deal with after having an abortion. And it was vigorously honest kind of poem, and I think it was called The Lost Baby Poem. But also she was really keen and astute, and she was able to, there's another poem called, it had a line that says, mine is already an African name, and the poem was called Lucille. But it was a poem that was digging into her own personal history and the ways in which who she was a product of who her ancestors were, who her grandparents were, who her mother was. And it was just a really powerful statement about how, our identity is complicated, but it's not something that necessarily needs to be rejected based on a new understanding of American history. But she had all of these poems, though, I think that were just really wrestling and thinking seriously about the world in which she lived in, that we lived in. One of the early poems that just stuck with me, it ends with, "Come celebrate with me. Every day something has tried to kill me and failed." You know, she would say something like that, and I could carry it around with me in my head for days, for weeks, for months, for the entire course of my time in prison. And honestly, like, she was the poet. I think, you think about poetry and you think about like this fancy thing, but the thing that Etheridge Knight and Lucille Clifton shared is they were the poets that most reminded me of like what my grandmother would be if she were a poet, or what my uncle would be if he was a poet. You know, folks that just had this wisdom, this sort of way of seeing the world that didn't really seem pretentious at all. Just seemed like loving and caring and trying to say something that matters, even through discussing really difficult terrain.
Coming to those poems in prison as a reader, did you immediately think this is something I want to do myself? And did you start writing poetry while you were in prison?
Yeah, well, see, I was kind of like, in some ways, a fool. In some ways, like, I was lucky because I didn't really understand enough about the world to think that the decisions I was making were hopelessly romantic. But as soon as I got sentenced to prison and I knew I was going to be away for 9 years, I said, I got to be something. You know, and I can't leave here and not be something. And I just said, I'm going to be a writer. And I didn't know what that meant, but I said, I'm going to be a writer. And so this is when I'm 16, and I'm 18 years old in solitary confinement when I get The Black Poets by Dudley Randall. And when I read Etheridge Knight, I said, I'm going to be him. You know, I'm going to be a black poet. He went to prison. He's writing this stunning verse. I mean, for Freckle-Faced Gerald was about a 16-year-old kid that went to prison and got raped in prison. And the thing was like I was a 16-year-old kid, and again, the poem made me think about my own vulnerability, but it made me think that, like, I had a lot to be grateful for because I hadn't been raped in prison. You know, like, I hadn't been abused. I hadn't, like, actually been, like, tortured. You know, I hadn't been forced to struggle with what it meant for me to stay safe. And the fact that it was a poet who made me humble, who made me aware of my own blessings, made me just think, you know, if I'm going to be a writer, I want to be a writer like him, somebody who could tell the truth about somebody else's life and make the world know it. I thought, you know, if I'm going to be a writer, that's the writer I'm going to be. And I already started calling myself Shaheed, which means the witness. And I was like, wait, you know, this is what Knight is doing. You know, he's a poet. He's witnessing. Yeah, I think this makes sense. I'm going to be a poet. And it already matches with how I had started to see myself in the world.
Going to Yale Law School is not typically, or to any law school, and you went to Yale, is not typically the path that one thinks of to become a poet, or even really to learn how to write in a way that anyone would want to read. And I'm curious how that experience in law school, how did that inform your poetry? Did it?
Yeah, you know, it's so funny. One of my first days, my first week, definitely, we had to go to this class. It was a legal writing class. And my professor, one of my mentors, good guy, he says, his name is Noah Messing, right? Well, he says, law school is the place where poets go to die. And I'm in the audience, and I'm older than everybody there at the time, right? And so I'm not as, I don't know, I'm a bit more mature. I got 2 children. And so I'll go up to him afterwards, and I'm just messing with him. And I'm like, you know, I'm a poet. So yeah, I published a couple books. And he felt so bad that he had said that he took me out to lunch. And then he became, you know, like somebody who I could go to, talk to, really great guy. But the point, and this is what I would say to him, really, is that it's far less distance between poetry and the law than people think. You know, both disciplines have a strict obsession with the precision of language and a sort of adherence to rules of craft that define what success is and failure is. And so, you know, I didn't come to law school to become a poet. I came to law school to become a lawyer. But through that whole process, I was reminded of how, like, close it is. And the best, I mean, really, you think about the best judges, Supreme Court justices, right? The ones who we admire the most are the ones who write well. You know, you think about Justice Sotomayor, whose writing is just sort of pristine. And even if you think about, like, Justice Scalia, his reputation really was so and like baked into his ability to write. He called somebody's ideas applesauce. And sometimes it almost sounded like he was a battle rapper taking shots at like legal ideas and theories that he thought just didn't jive with his understanding of the Constitution. So I'm just not sure if there's as much distance between the two worlds as we think. I think the point, though, is just when you become a poet, 100% of the time, you are trying to convey the truth with some kind of pristine facility with language and words, where when you're a lawyer, sometimes, unfortunately, you try to obscure the truth with your facility with words and language.
Well, speaking of obscuring the truth, some of the poems in this collection, they're redacted. There are large portions of the text blacked out. There's a poem in here called In Missouri with a date line, I guess, or we would call it a date line in journalism, the city of Ferguson. Talk a little bit about these redacted poems. You also have one in California. What were you trying to do there?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time. I mean, quiet as kept. We think about social justice, we think about criminal justice reform, but it's not as connected to literature as it should be. And for me, I think writing poetry, fiction, nonfiction has always been a way to, know the world. So I think if somebody reads that Times piece I wrote, I think they'll know me in a different way, and they'll know the way I think about things in a different way. But it's not much attention to arts and sort of this national criminal justice reform movement. At least it hadn't been before the past few years. And I wanted to sort of take that on. And I wanted to do two things: encourage myself to sort of write more openly and directly about some of these issues. And also I wanted to say, how do you actually go straight to the root? And you take cases, and these cases were filed by the Civil Rights Corps, suing, Montgomery, Ferguson, Houston, for money bail violations. So for locking people up because they couldn't pay bail or because they owed traffic tickets and fees to the city. And the lawsuits, they won several of these lawsuits, won settlements of $1 million, changed the landscape of bail in some of these states, right? So the lawsuits were really important, but nobody really will ever read a 70-page legal complaint. And so I thought, how do I take that complaint? I take all of the words that's there, and I just use redaction, not as a tool to imply that certain things are above your pay grade, but as a tool to say some of the stuff is superfluous. So let me boil this 70-page complaint down to a poem that makes you really know what's happening. And I will boil the 70-page complaint down to like a 4-page poem or 8-page poem or a 10-page poem. And in the book, I have 4 of those. And the one for Houston, is the judges speaking, because I wanted people to be able to hear, what the judges were saying in response to this.
Would you read a portion of one of those redacted poems in Alabama? I'm curious to hear how you read this.
In Alabama, in the middle of Alabama,
versus the city of Montgomery. The plaintiffs, impoverished, jailed by the city, unable to pay traffic tickets, pay or sit in jail. $50 per day, plaintiffs unable to pay, each sent to jail, told they could work off debts. $25 per day, cleaning the city, scrubbing feces and blood from jail floors. The treatment reveals the city against its poorest, jailing people if they poor. Plaintiffs seek fundamental rights. They suffered. The city's unlawful. It is the policy of the city to jail people. It is the policy of the city to jail people. It is the policy of the city to hold prisoners until extinguished. It is the policy. Plaintiffs seek relief. A 23-year-old woman, mother of 2. Police officers came, arrested her. She owed the city. Officers took away her 2 children. She too poor to pay. Told
she was served, taken to jail, desperate to get back children, labored to clean jail bars.
Do you work with prisoners now? Do you teach poetry and poetry writing to prisoners?
I'm invited all the time to go inside and give talks and give readings. And then when I go, sometimes I do workshops. It depends on the set. There's a lot of prisons now that actually have writing programs, so frequently I get invited and I go in and do it that way. I think it's really important to return, so I really do return whenever I can. And typically I'll get invited by a university somewhere and get to go into a local jail or prison that's close. I've returned to give commencement speeches. I mean, I've literally been in prisons in Oregon, Wisconsin, Chicago, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. I've been like all over the place, and I've been to a prison in Port-au-Prince, which was a really disturbing experience in a lot of ways. But, part of it, though, I feel like is most of these universities. I mean, I've been to universities across the country, too. And when I was locked up, nobody really came inside to kick it with us. Nobody came inside, no writer came inside to read their work, to sort of just stand in front of us and answer whatever random questions that we might have had about the art or their life. And so I try to make it a point to do that really whenever I can.
Do you think of yourself as sort of functioning in a way that the poets you read in prison, that role that they played for you while you were inside?
I won't be as presumptuous to say that I'm in any way like Etheridge Knight, Lucille Clifton, Fall Weaver, Elizabeth Alexander. I mean, these are people that I wrote letters to while I was locked up. These are people who, I started reading not expecting to be. I didn't know what it meant to be a published poet. I just wanted to be a writer. I just wanted to emulate these folks, wanted to be like these folks. I mean, I think about Inazaki Shange, and I think this is who was with me when I was in solitary confinement. Rita Dove. I've been fortunate to meet a lot of these people since I've been home. And I've been fortunate to meet others who I didn't even read in prison, but they've come to be reference points for me, like stars in the sky that exist only in my head, right? I won't be so presumptuous as to say that I am able to be that for anybody else, but I do like to be available to the degree that I can. I'm probably not known to most folks, and I'm working to make myself more known. And this is why I appreciate being on this podcast, though, right? Because the point is that, one version of the story is that this is just Dwayne wants people to know his name. But the real version of the story, the true version of the story is, poetry and literature literally saved my life. And this is not something that I say because it makes me sound cool or interested. This is I was in a dark and dank cell that had no AC, and it was 120 degrees outside, it felt like. And I'm reading Etheridge Knight, and it's literally reshifting how I think about who I am in the world. And so I am hoping to continue to do the work, to be present in the lives of men and women who are really a part of this community that birthed me, and that community, sadly and tragically, is the community of prisons.
Well, not to get you thinking about 10, 20, 30 years from now, but I expect your work will be saving some lives. So, Dwayne, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Reginald Dwayne Betts is a poet, memoirist, public defender. His new collection is called Felon. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining us now from London, Jung Chang. Her new book is called Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister, 3 Women at the Heart of 20th Century China. Jung, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this book is your 4th book and your 4th biography of a kind. Your first book was a memoir, but also the story of your mother and your grandmother. And you followed this with a biography of Mao and then another biography of the Dowager Cixi. How do you choose the subjects of your books?
I came to Britain in 1978. It was just after Mao's death and the end of the Cultural Revolution. I was one of the first group of 14 people to come and study in Britain. I had wanted to be a writer, but when I was in China, it was impossible even to dream of becoming a writer because nearly all writers were condemned in those years when I was growing up in China in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I myself had to destroy my first poem which I wrote on my 16th birthday. And in the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant, and then as a steel worker, and then as an electrician. And when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, I would be writing in my head with an imaginary pen. But I couldn't put pen to paper. And when I came to Britain in 1978, I could write, but then I didn't want to write because Britain in those years was like another planet. I just wanted to enjoy the new life. Then 10 years after I came to Britain, my mother came to stay with me in London in 1988. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life and stories of my grandmother and about her relationship with my father. And then I said to myself, I've got to write all this down. And I then realized how much I wanted to be a writer and how much I always wanted to be a writer. And my mother stayed with me for 6 months. She talked every day. She left me 60 hours of tape recordings when she left London. After my mother left, I wrote Wild Swans. So that's how I came to write my first book, the book that made me a writer. After Wild Swans was published in the early 1990s, Mao seemed to be the obvious subject because he dominated my earlier life, and I just wanted to learn more about him. And I spent 12 years writing with my husband, John Halliday, a biography of Mao. And after the biography of Mao was published, Empress Dowager Cixi, who was born in 1835 and died in 1908, again seemed to be an obvious subject because I had become interested in her when I was researching Wild Swans. And I had been told that foot binding, which had tortured my grandmother and Chinese women for 1,000 years, had been banned by the communists. And then while I was researching Wild Swans, I realized it had been banned by her, by Empress Dowager Cixi, and that got me very interested in her. So after the biography of Mao was published, I wrote her biography. Now, I then had this question: what happened in the 40 years between the Empress Dowager's death in 1908 and Mao seizing power in 1949? And when the Empress Dowager died, she had committed, before she died, she had committed to turn China into a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament. And yet, 4 decades later, China was plunged into a totalitarian hell. I wanted to know what happened in those 4 decades. And the 3 Song sisters, together with their husbands, Sun Yat-sen, who was called the father of Republican China, because he was the first person to advocate republicanism, and Chiang Kai-shek, the ruler of China, before Mao drove him out of mainland China to Taiwan. Their stories are the stories of those 4 decades. So I started to write their stories.
There's an obvious parallel there in that you're writing about 3 women, just as you did in your memoir, Wild Swans, but of course, it's not a personal story to you. And I'm curious, how did that change the process for you?
Well, I wrote Wild Swans, kind of straight from my heart and my mind. The stories, some of the stories I had written in my head when I was in China, but the story of the 3 sisters is a biography. I have to do a lot of research, archive research. Most of the archives are in the United States, which was a blessing. It's so difficult researching in other places, but in the States, it was wonderful. I kept my distance from them. I leave my readers to make up their minds whether they feel sympathy or distaste towards them. So it's a different writing process.
Obviously, writing about Mao, you lived under his regime, so you had very direct impression of him, experience of what it was like in China under him. But I imagine as well, as a girl growing up in China, you grew up with some kind of perception of the Sung sisters. You said that you first encountered them as fairy tale figures. Can you explain in what way and how were they perceived when you were growing up in China?
Everybody knew their names, of course, in China. And it is said that, once upon a time, there were three sisters in China. One loves money, one loves power, and one loves her country. And that was the communist take of the three sisters. And of course, the one who was supposed to be loving her country was the red sister, Qingling. But with the little sister, Mei Ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, we heard purely negative things. For example, one thing was that she took a bath every day in milk, and that's what kept her skin fine, extremely fine. I think one day one of our teachers was trying to address this myth and said tentatively, "Do you really think it would be pleasant bathing in milk?" But soon he joined the condemned rank of the rightists. We also heard that Red Sister Qingling, who was Mao's vice chair by this time, had an affair with his chief bodyguard, and people were arguing whether they were married or not. And I was very struck by this when I was a child, when I heard this. And this was because nobody talked about any other leader in China, about their private lives particularly. Their private lives were kept completely secret from the rest of the country. She was the only person to be talked about. And of course, now I realize the reason, having researched this book of the three sisters. She was the only woman in the leadership, which consisted of only men except her. And she also was an independent spirit. She chose communism. The regime could not completely trust her. They had to, every now and then kind of blackmail her. And the thing that was the most effective weapon was that she would no longer be Madame Sun Yat-sen, because Sun Yat-sen had gone into the myth as the father of China. And being Madame Sun Yat-sen was the best protection for her against all the, purges, constant purges in the communist world. And so she is most afraid of not being regarded as Madame Sun Yat-sen. So that was the kind of nationwide rumor, was a kind of threat dangling over her head.
It's so extraordinary that these three women, when you think about the ways in which they differed but also achieved such prominence in three different ways, Qingling, as you mentioned, the wife of Sun Yat-sen, and then also Mao's vice chair eventually, Mei Ling as Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and then Ai Ling, who was also one of Chiang's senior advisors and an incredibly wealthy woman during that period of China, that they all came from the same family. So I'd like to talk a little bit about their origins, their family life. They were born in a 10-year span between 1888 and 1898. What was China like then, and what was the family they were born into?
The one thing particular about the family, it was that it was a deeply religious family. The sister's mother came from the oldest Christian family in China. A district in Shanghai is named after her ancestor, who was China's earliest Christian. And their father was the first Chinese to be converted to Methodism by the Southern Methodists. And he had come to America in 1878 as an unskilled worker, but as a kind of a coolie. but he ran away and ended up in the American South. He was converted by the Southern Methodists, and he spent 7 years in the American South and then went back to China as a preacher. Now, those 7 years determined the sisters' future because their father was determined to give them an American education. So he sent the 3 daughters to America to attend college when they were basically children. And Eileen and Qingling went when they were 14. And Meiling, little sister, was only 9 when she was sent to America. And she spent 10 years in America. What struck me was most extraordinary was that the girls were in America completely on their own with no adult family members to look after them. And such was their father's faith or their parents' faith in American society and in the Methodist community.
It's pretty extraordinary that they were the first Chinese girls to go to university in America. What was their experience like? And in doing your research, did you come upon records of their time here as students?
Yes, the first went to Macon, Georgia, and Eileen, big sister, was there in 1904 when she was 14. And her experience was not entirely pleasant. This had something to do with her own character. She made no friends there. She was quite lonely. She was very self-contained. But she also had a fierce intelligence. I read her graduation essay in the archives of Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia. And it was astonishingly mature and perceptive when she was a teenager. She talked about Confucius, and she said Confucius, China's cultural icon. Confucius' main mistake was he didn't treat women properly. And she said no nation is going to become great without the emancipation of its womanhood. And the other 2 sisters followed. Meiling, little sister, had an entirely good life in America. She was outgoing and she made many friends and she had a wonderful time. And in fact, she had a lifelong correspondence with an American woman called Emma Mills. And their correspondence in Wellesley College, which was the college that little sister went after Wesleyan. And her correspondence with Emma Mills was a tremendous treasure trove about her character, her experience, because it's right from their college days to very near their death. Meiling lived a long life, and she died in New York, aged 105 in 2003. And both she and Eileen settled in New York and really were like New Yorkers.
When you think about what might explain how 3 such extraordinary women came from the same family, did you come up with an answer to that question?
Well, their family was extraordinary, and their father chose to support Sun Yat-sen when Sun Yat-sen was a clandestine Republican, plotting to overthrow the monarchy, the Manchu monarchy. So that made them very important because of their association with the founding father of Republican China. And that gave them the proximity, the closeness to power when the Republicans seized the power, when they overthrew the Manchu dynasty. And they were right there next to Sun Yat-sen. In fact, Sun Yat-sen was very keen on Eileen and courted her. She was Sun Yat-sen's English language assistant, and Sun courted her, and she turned Sun Yat-sen down because Sun was already married with a wife and 3 children, a concubine and other consorts. Basically, he was a womanizer. And Eileen turned him down, but then he turned his attention to Qingling, Red sister, Qingling was passionate. She fell in love with him and she married him in spite of her family's fierce opposition. So that made them very close to the center of power to start with.
We talked about Qingling and her political path. She became quite left-wing, a ardent communist. And Mei Ling, of course, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, went in the opposite direction, more right-wing nationalist in the path of Sun Yat-sen. Let's talk a little bit about Ai Ling, because though she was one of Chiang's senior advisors, her path wasn't overtly political.
Well, she actually had a very political mind. I mean, in the observation of little sister Mei Ling, and she was the most brilliant in the family. And Chiang Kai-shek was older than big sister Ai Ling, but he called her big sister and consulted her, and she was the person who exercised the most influence on him. And it was Ai Ling who brought Chiang Kai-shek together with Mei Ling and made the marriage. And she introduced her sister to Chiang Kai-shek when Chiang Kai-shek had just revealed that he was fiercely anti-communist, because before he had pretended to be pro-communism. And because that's how Sun Yat-sen became when Sun Yat-sen turned to Russia for help to overthrow the Beijing government. And so Chiang Kai-shek started pretending to be pro-Russian. Then in 1926, after Sun Yat-sen died the year before, Chiang Kai-shek revealed his true color, which was fiercely anti-communist. And big sister Ai Ling was anti-communist. And he spotted this, and he spotted that Chiang Kai-shek had a future in China.
What were the relationships like between the three sisters? Did they always get along?
Big sister Ai Ling and little sister Mei Ling were very, very close. Their age gap is about 10 years. So Mei Ling regarded her elder sister like a mother. She listened to big sister and did what big sister told her to do. And so they're very close. And Red sister, obviously for ideological reasons, was distant from the two sisters. And she also hated Chiang Kai-shek, both for ideological reasons and for personal reasons, because she fell in love with a man after Sun Yat-sen's death. And that man, Deng Yanda, was trying to form a third party, different from the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. And he became a threat to Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek had him murdered. And she devoted her life helping Mao beat Chiang Kai-shek.
You mentioned early on that you grew up with the idea that foot binding had been outlawed, banned by the communists, when in fact it was banned by the Empress Dowager Cixi. And I'm wondering if you think that when Chinese people look at their history today, if they properly acknowledge the influence of women like the Song sisters.
Well, I mean, history is the biggest taboo. I mean, real history. Today, you're not allowed to research history, to write about history differently from the party line. So the Empress Dowager Cixi remained maligned. She has been maligned for 100 years. She is still blamed for all China's troubles, a century of humiliation or whatever. And the sisters, the Song sisters, and of course the communists, Red sister, has always been given the great honor, and she is called the mother of modern China. And the other two anti-communist sisters are getting a rather good press nowadays because Beijing wanted to bring Taiwan into its fold. And in Taiwan, I mean, there are many admirers of the sisters, particularly Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
Well, this is an interesting corrective and rounding out then to that official version of history in China. Jung, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Jung Chang's new book is called Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister, 3 Women at the Heart of 20th Century China. Joining us now are critics Dwight Garner, Jennifer Salai, and Parl Sagel. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Dwight. What did you review this week?
I reviewed 2 books about eating, which, is one of my favorite things to read about and do. One is by Adam Platt. He's the food critic for New York Magazine. He wrote The Book of Eating, which is sort of a memoir. And there's another one called Serious Eater by Ed Levine, who runs the website Serious Eats. I really like the Platt book. I mean, he's fun to read in New York Magazine. He's more fun to read here, talking about just what it's like to be a professional food critic. I mean, he gets gout and he begins to take horse pill sized tablets of antacid, and he worries about hitting the blimp line. His brother is the actor Oliver Platt, and Oliver Platt calls the blimp line 300 pounds. And it's just fun to read Platt on eating. And he was there in New York Magazine for sort of this crucial moment in the food world where the French chef hegemony has kind of gone away, and it's grown more egalitarian. Blogs and websites and Instagram has really changed the food world, and he's really good about that stuff.
Dwight, you've flirted with food criticism yourself, haven't you?
Yeah, it's funny. I live with someone, my wife, who's written cookbooks, and, she has such a perfect palate. And I think to myself, I couldn't do it. I'm not sure I have the palate that you need to be a really good food critic. But I will say that one of the good things about Platt's book is that he's very low key about his own abilities. He doesn't pretend to be a super foodie. He's just sort of like a normal eater. And I kind of like that about his book.
Do you find that there are things to learn from food criticism for a book critic?
Interesting. Well, it's funny. Clive James once said to me that he didn't think, and I was talking to him in his house in Cambridge, he didn't think that there was enough in food criticism to sustain a career. He said something like, he wasn't sure that food critics have enough to say about life in their work to really, he wasn't sure he could see doing that for a career. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I think you read someone like Pete Wells at the Times and other critics, and they're really talking about everything in their reviews, not just food, but class and all kinds of things. And so I love to read food criticism, and I read it all the time.
Parl, Jen, do you read food criticism?
I mean, I haven't read a lot of food criticism, but like the few people that I have read, I don't even know if you can talk about her as a food critic. She's a food writer. People like MFK Fisher, I love. Right. And she's writing about wartime. As you say, Dwight, she's writing about everything. And I do read them sometimes when I want to be replenished in my adjectives.
Yes.
They've got like much more sensuous writing, in the same way that when I feel like I'm getting a little dry, I like to read music criticism for the emotion. So in that sense, like I kind of like to move around a little bit.
Yeah, and with music criticism too, somehow, at least for me, it feels so ephemeral that I feel like they're very skilled at finding those adjectives.
It's all feeling.
Yeah.
Music criticism is all mood and feeling, and it's so fantastic to see somebody riff in that kind of way. They don't have to necessarily, some do, but like really unpack ideas sometimes in the ways that a lot of us do, especially with nonfiction, especially stuff that you do, Jen.
Yeah.
As a young writer, I love to read A.J. Liebling and Calvin Trillin both, because they're both these masterful users of metaphor and simile. And I think about them a lot when I'm writing criticism.
You haven't really mentioned the Levine book. I take it you didn't enjoy that as much as the Platt.
Oh, it's just not good. And Ed Levine, I gather from people who know him, he's an excellent person, and I like his website. But his book, it's funny. I just... it's like being a foodie, I guess, in that I can no longer, as someone who reads books for a living, and I just can't take the number of cliches that he has in his book. And I assume that, Ed Levine has a very sophisticated palate, and I assume that he would never put up with cliches in the food he eats, and yet his book is just packed with them on every single page, and it's just hard to read a book like that.
I actually now want someone to have a menu full of cliches, like a cliched menu. What would that look like? What's a food cliche?
I'm surprised that publishers don't have some kind of computer program now. You can just search a book for cliches and at least get rid of some of them. I mean, everyone needs a cliche once in a while.
Well, but Pamela's question is interesting. So, like, for us, we try to stay away from the dreaded compelling, for example. What is a food cliche that you wish you could sort of cast into oblivion?
In the Levine book, I mean, he's like, this butterscotch budino will change your life. Here's an egg foo young that will change your life. And the same kind of compelling words, delicious. I mean, Adam Platt says in his book that his whole life is one long search for different ways to say delicious.
That's very good.
All right, from food to goats. Parl.
Okay. A goat who narrowly escapes being food. There's a great Juna Barnes quote that I love, and she says that every now and again you find everything you can't stand in one person and you fall in love with them anyway. And this is how I feel about this book. It's the story of a goat by Perumal Murugan, a Tamilian Indian writer. And again, I don't dislike fables, but I don't run to them. I don't dislike books about animals. I kind of do dislike books about animals. I find them a little bit like manipulative, but this is a fable about a very unhappy, very unlucky little goat, and it tells the whole story of her life. And I just found it to be just incredibly moving. It's incredibly sad. It's incredibly hard reading at points. It's written so cleanly and so crisply that you kind of cannot stop reading it as you're reading this like litany of struggle and of famine, and you can sense between the lines that this is also some kind of allegory of village life, some allegory of what's happening in India right now. But you don't need to know that to enjoy this book. And some of the things like politically that the book is interested in are very universal. It's about the power of the mob and colorism and all forms of oppression and sort of like the restricted lives given to women. But the real like question that nagged me as I was reading this is like, why am I still reading this? And why does it feel interesting and important sometimes to go to books to encounter these scenes of suffering, and especially suffering of this like very small, very good-natured little goat.
I know,
but is very much on her side. You know,
how does she suffer? I want to know.
She suffers. You know, she's very small when she's born. She kind of can't get enough to eat. They try, like the people looking after, try to fatten her up. She falls in love and she can't be with the goat she wants to be with. You know, she's bred very violently. She sees her playmates castrated when they reach sexual maturity. It's goat life, which I can't imagine is necessarily easy. But as you're reading it, it feels very important to read it. It really does. It felt very important to read this particular life story. And it's also narrated without a lot of sentimentality. It's not cloying. You enter her consciousness every now and again, but it's a very good consciousness to be in. She's wry and observant. And she seems to sort of like look at her lot with like a fair amount of equanimity, and she has small moments of heroism. And it felt honest. I think that's the thing that I kept coming back to. I was like, to read this feels like to see these things that ordinarily feel hidden or they feel too small to be the subjects of great literature, or they feel like they'll make us feel too guilty. But to sit with her and watch her whole life I felt so lucky to be able to do it. So especially if you're fable or goat agnostic is a good one for you.
Who's the author, and were you familiar with this person?
Yes. Perumal Murugan. I'd reviewed his previous book for us, and he's very controversial. His previous book was about a sort of archaic temple ritual in which childless women could go and sleep with men they weren't married to for one night in the hopes of getting pregnant. Naturally, this did not go over well with right-wing Hindus who felt like, you're maligning sacred Hindu womanhood. And he was sort of hounded from his village. He had to leave his work. His books were torched. And there was a sort of landmark ruling in India that defended his right to free expression. And he came back to writing feeling very tentative and feeling like, I don't want to write about humans. I don't want to get into trouble again. And he found a beautiful way to keep telling these sort of very fearless stories by telling the story of the little goat.
How has this novel been received in India?
Very well. It's good to tuck some of your angriest writing where people don't think to look, So yeah, highly recommend.
Jen.
So last week I reviewed a book called The Crying Book by a poet named Heather Crystal. And I guess the title gives you a sense of what's in it. It essentially is a book about crying, but it's also a memoir of her becoming a mother as well as losing a friend to suicide. And the way it's structured is in this form that other writers, especially poets, I think, have sort of taken to when it comes to writing the combination of memoir as well as cultural observation, where it's these discrete paragraphs of text, some of them as short as a sentence, and all those parts accumulate into something where you have a sense not only of this person's life, but also how they see the world. And it's fascinating. I mean, the memoir parts I thought were really interesting, but also she makes these observations about tears and the science of tears, which I had no idea about, that there's 3 kinds of tears, and that emotional tears are actually the ones that are filled with the most protein. The suspicion is that they're that way because what happens is that they fall more slowly, and so there's a communicative aspect to emotional crying. So
what are the 2 other kinds?
The 2 other kinds are basal tears, which is just the tears that we're always making just to lubricate our eyes, and then irritant tears. So if something gets in your eye, your body will manufacture these tears in order to expel whatever it is. But emotional tears are different. And so, she looks at crying also as this form of communication, which means that there's a way in which she doesn't entirely always trust it, which I think is also interesting because, on the one hand, she looks at people who talk about crying as like a natural force and that it's just something that overcomes you and that you just sort of submit to it.
It's so authentic.
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, you have to admit that there are some tears that are shed that we're not exactly sure what the authenticity or what the motivation.
Can my toddler sit in for this, please?
There you go.
I know. I was wondering if crocodile tears have high protein.
So this is actually, it's funny because I kept waiting for her to talk about crocodile tears, and she talks about them in different forms, but not that particular, what we were talking about, cliches earlier. She talks about the social aspect of tears, the way that especially, a white woman like her is part of a demographic where historically white women's tears were valued in a particular way, and, white men would often use them in order to protect what they said was a white woman's honor or dignity. And often that came at the expense of people of color. So she goes into that social history as well. That's a very important part of the book. And, she treats it very seriously. But there's also some comical aspects that she looks at crying. And also right at the beginning, what I really appreciated, I think, was that I was expecting, you expect a book like this and you're like, oh, God, it's going to be what Parl was saying about the fable of agnostic. I was thinking, a book about crying, it's going to be all sentiment.
Yeah, what about laughing until you cry? Are
That's
those protein tears?
Well, it's funny because she looks at a particular artist, Bas-Jan Otter, I think is his name. He's a Dutch artist who disappeared without a trace. And that's a whole other story in this book. But he had this whole thing where he filmed himself crying. And if you look at a still, you actually can't really tell if he's crying or laughing. And so that's another aspect of looking at crying on this continuum of experience. But also what she says is, this whole idea of ennobling suffering, especially of the beautiful literary woman who becomes more beautiful when she's crying. She dispenses with that immediately right at the beginning where she says, if you're really crying, you basically look hideous.
So a lot of ground gets covered.
A lot. And it's short.
Yeah. All right. Goats, tears, and food. Dwight, what books did you review again?
Adam Platt's book, The Book of Eating, and Ed Levine's Serious Eats.
Parl?
I reviewed The Story of a Goat by Perumal Murugan.
And I reviewed The Crying Book by Heather Crystal.
All right, Jen, Parl, Dwight, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.